Before history was ever written, before humanity knew what was coming, the world, in a heavy silence, was moving toward its end. There was no war, no disease, but something that could consume everything. And in the middle of that silence, there was a man who knew the truth. He began building a ship in a place where there was no sea, and no one knew that this was the last chance to survive. This story comes from some of the oldest texts in human history, from the Bible and the Quran. We present what is written in these texts, but when it comes to science, what remains is an unbiased examination of reality. And at the same time, life went on. People worked, they laughed, and lived their days as if nothing had changed. There were no signs of what was coming. And that man, among them, was the only one who saw something different. And at the same time, life went on. People worked, they laughed, and lived their days as if nothing had changed. There were no signs of what was coming. And that man, among them, was the only one who saw something different. Perhaps it is better to go back to a day when Noah lay beside his great ark, looking up at the sky. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble. He stood up, and in the distance, he saw something, animals from every direction, moving toward him. Calm, ordered, without chaos, walking toward the ark. Noah opened the doors, and they, one by one, entered. From every kind, a pair, male and female. After the animals had entered, Noah turned back. He did not run, he did not panic. He simply walked, one last time, toward his people, to warn them, to tell them that what was coming was real, and that there was still time to leave and come with him. But the city had already chosen not to listen. Noah turned away. There was nothing more to say. He walked back toward the ark. His family followed him, step by step, toward the only place left. But not all of them came. One of his sons stayed behind, and no matter how much Noah called, he would not follow. For a moment, there was only silence. Then the wind began to change. The sky grew darker. The air became heavier. And then the first drops fell, slowly, softly, almost unnoticed. But they did not stop. And soon, the world outside began to disappear. After the flood, the stories begin to diverge. In the Bible, Noah sends out birds, and the ark comes to rest upon the mountains of Ararat. In the Quran, the waters are commanded to recede, and the ark rests upon Mount Judy. And in the older Babylonian flood story, a different man survives, but the memory of the flood remains the same. A boat, a mountain, a world washed clean. But now comes the real question. Could any of this have actually happened? Could a ship like this really have been built in the ancient world? Could it survive the weight, the water, the animals, the food, the time? And if a flood like this ever happened, what would science have to say about it? Let's start with the ship itself. Because before the animals, before the flood, before everything else, one question comes first. Could a structure like Noah's Ark actually have been built? If we start with the ship itself, the first surprise is this. In some of the most ancient religious texts, the vessel is not described as a small boat. but as a structure measuring 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high, roughly 135 meters long, 23 meters wide, and about 14 meters high, depending on the cubit used. That would make it roughly the length of a modern football field. And at that size, this was no simple wooden vessel. It would have been an enormous engineering challenge. Other ancient texts do not focus on exact dimensions, but rather on the event itself, the flood, the command, and the survival. So from a scientific point of view, if we want to test the idea of Noah's Ark, the only usable structural dimensions come from the oldest surviving descriptions. And that leads to the first real engineering question. Could human beings in the ancient world actually build a wooden structure that large? If we look at it purely from an engineering perspective, the problem is not just the size, it's the material. In the ancient world, large ships were made of wood, and wood has limits. As a wooden structure gets longer, it begins to bend. This bending is known as hogging and sagging, where the center rises or the ends drop, depending on how forces move through the hull. And at around this scale, roughly the size described in the ancient accounts, those forces become critical. Even in much later history, with far more advanced shipbuilding techniques, very large wooden ships still faced the same problem. Many of them twisted, leaked, or even began to fail under their own weight. Because unlike steel, wood cannot easily maintain rigidity across very large distances. So the real challenge is not just building a structure like this, but keeping it stable. And that raises a serious question. Could ancient construction methods, without modern reinforcement, really keep a wooden structure this large from failing? One of the largest wooden ships ever built, the Wyoming, still suffered from the same problems: flexing, leaking, and struck. At first, the idea sounds simple. Take the animals, bring them aboard, and survive the flood. But the moment you try to imagine it realistically, the problem becomes much bigger. Because animals does not mean a few sheep or a handful of birds. It means creatures of every size: large, small, wild, fragile, dangerous, and difficult to manage. Some would need only a small space. Others would require enormous room just to stand, turn, rest, or survive the journey. And the challenge was not only how many there were, but how different they were from one another. Different bodies, different behavior, different needs. So before we even ask whether they could all fit, we first have to understand something much more basic. What exactly would have needed to go inside? Even if the animals could fit, there was another problem: food. Because every creature on board would need to eat. Not once, not for a day, but again and again and again. And not all animals eat the same thing. Some would need grain. Some would need plants. Some would need meat. And some would require something far more specific. So the challenge was not only how much food had to be carried, but how many different kinds of food would have to be stored at the same time. And suddenly, the Ark was no longer just a ship full of animals. It was becoming something else entirely: a floating survival system. And then there was water, because food alone would never be enough. Every creature on board would also need to drink, again and again and again. And water is not light. It is heavy, difficult to store, difficult to move, and impossible to ignore. So now the Ark was not only carrying life, it was carrying the weight of survival itself. And that means the real burden of the Ark was growing far beyond the animals alone. And this is only a handful of animals for a single day, because just 4 species, with only 1 pair of each, 2 elephants, 2 horses, 2 cows, and 2 camels, could consume roughly 510 to 950 liters of water in a single day. That means that for just 8 animals, the Ark could already be carrying half a ton to nearly 1 full ton of water every day. Now imagine that, multiplied again and again and again. More animals, more food, more water, more time. And suddenly, the question is no longer just, could they fit? The real question becomes, could all of that weight really be carried? And the problem did not end with food and water, because the animals would not only eat and drink, they would also produce waste. A lot of it. And in a closed wooden structure, that becomes a serious problem. Because waste does not only take up space, it also releases gases. And once those gases begin to build up, air becomes part of the survival problem too. Not just food, not just water, but breathing and ventilation. Before anything else, we need to ask a more basic question. How many animals are we really talking about? Because even today, we still do not know the exact number of animal species on Earth. Modern science has formally described around 2 million species in total, but the true number is believed to be much higher. And if we exclude marine life, we are still left with an enormous number of land animals, birds, reptiles, insects, and other creatures. So if this story refers to preserving life on land, the scale becomes difficult to even imagine. And 7,000 years ago, that number becomes even harder to know, because we do not know exactly how many species were alive then, which ones had already disappeared, or how biodiversity differed from the world we know today. So before we ask whether they could fit inside the Ark, we have to admit something first. We do not even know the full size of the problem. Your questions. Noah's age and the possibility of building the Ark. According to the ancient account, Noah was already 600 years old when the flood came, and he is said to have lived to 950. The text does not give an exact number of years for how long the Ark took to build, but based on the timeline, many place it somewhere around 75 to 120 years. And if this happened roughly 7,000 years ago, then we are talking about a world with no engines, no cranes, no shipyards, and no modern industrial tools. So the question is no longer just whether the Ark could float. The question is, could it even be built? Could the animals be sedated? Some modern films imagine a simple solution: sedate the animals, keep them asleep, and reduce the problem. But in reality, that would create new dangers of its own. Because keeping large numbers of different animals sedated for long periods would require precise dosing, monitoring, hydration, and survival support. And without modern veterinary medicine, that quickly becomes dangerous, unreliable, and in many cases, fatal. So, scientifically speaking, mass sedation is not a realistic solution. Could rainwater solve the problem? Another common idea is rainwater. And yes, rainwater could potentially be collected, but that would not solve the full problem, because collecting water is not the same as storing it, and storing it is not the same as distributing it. Large amounts of water would still need containers, space, management, and reliable daily access. So even if rain helped, it would not remove the burden. It would only reduce part of it. And then comes the geological question. Did an event like this ever happen in the real world? Here, science becomes much more cautious, because modern geology does not support a global flood covering the entire Earth in the way the ancient story describes it. But many researchers do believe that very large regional floods did happen in the ancient Near East. and that such catastrophic events may have helped inspire the flood traditions preserved in later texts. So from a geological perspective, a massive flood event is possible. But a global one, as literally described, is not supported by mainstream Earth science. And finally, the question almost everyone asks, has Noah's Ark actually been found? The short answer is, no confirmed scientific discovery exists. Over the years, there have been many claims, mountains, anomalies, unusual rock formations, and supposed remains, but none of them have been accepted by mainstream archaeology or geology as verified evidence of the Ark itself. So, despite decades of searching, there is still no scientifically confirmed Ark.